It's the week ending Friday, the 11th of April, and this is The Week Unwrapped. In the past 7 days, we've seen global stock markets yo-yoing in response to Donald Trump's whiplash tariff policies. Ukraine claiming to have captured Chinese citizens fighting alongside Russian units, and Leslie Manville and John Lithgow bagging Best Actress and Best Actor at the 2025 Olivier Awards in London. You can read all you need to know about everything that matters in The Week magazine, but we're here to bring you some stories that passed under the radar this week. Big news, not making headlines right now, but with repercussions for all our lives. I'm Arion McNicoll. Let's unwrap the week. And with Olly away for 2 more weeks, joining me today from the week's digital team, it's Harriet Marsden and the boss man Holden Frith, and host of The Spectator's Chinese Whispers podcast, it's Cindy Yu. Now, the Olivier Awards weren't the only big awards this week. The BAFTA Game Awards were also on, and I'm not sure if you've heard of it, but Astrobot got the top award. Question for you lot, though. Favourite childhood video game, Cindy?
I wasn't allowed to play video games because I grew up in a Chinese family.
Wow. Okay, well, favourite video game that you're playing now that you're, presumably allowed to?
Yeah. Making up for lost time. Legend of Zelda, definitely.
Nice. Yes. Holden?
Sensible Soccer for me.
Oh, brilliant. Great game. Amiga, I presume?
I think Commodore.
Commodore 64, crikey.
Yeah.
We're dating ourselves. And Harriet?
Well, it's a tie between Ocarina of Time, so I'm also a Zelda girl like Cindy, and Super Smash Brothers.
Yeah. Cindy, you're up first. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
This is the week that science has made another triumph over nature.
Grace had always been the most maternal out of the siblings, and it just felt incredibly unfair that she was struggling the way that she was, and for my journey to have been so easy and lovely and knowing how just wonderful it was, there was no question that I wanted to be there for her.
Amy Purdy speaking to Sky News on Monday. What's the story you're bringing us this week, Cindy?
So it transpired this week that the first baby born in the UK from a transplanted womb was born in late February, but the news only broke this week because the family decided to go public with it. You heard from Amy Purdy there, who is the sister who donated her womb to her sister, Grace Davidson. And Grace was born without a womb and got diagnosed at the age of 19, thinking that she could never have a child. Because of this medical breakthrough, she was able to have Amy's womb, gave birth to a healthy baby daughter who she also has named Amy earlier this year, and it was just a kind of a medical miracle, really. It's very early on in this medical technology, as I say, the first in the UK, although there are a few more dozens worldwide, and it's just a fascinating opportunity to be offered to apparently 1 in 5,000 women are born without wombs, but obviously raises all sorts of ethical concerns over donation, over adoption, over demographics, and so on.
Okay, so I'm going to have to pull you up on a slight point of order because this story wasn't exactly under the radar. Which part of it did you feel the big news outlets reporting missed?
So I think obviously, as I say, it's quite a miraculous medical trial, but looking into the details of the trial, it seems that the charity behind it, Womb Transplant UK, has the permission to complete 15 transplants. And of those, actually the majority of those, 10 of those transplants, are with deceased donors. So I think this is something that was new to me until reading the story, that actually, because of the opt-out system in organ donation that was put into the UK in 2020, coinciding with this womb transplant clinical trial, it means that women who are deceased can, with the permission of their families, also have those wombs donated after death. Again, as I say, that raises all sorts of ethical issues and questions.
Yeah, so Harriet, if we're talking about those donations that have taken place and are scheduled to take place using deceased donors, is that the controversial side of this, and how many operations have been done so far and how many more are there to go?
Yeah, so Grace was the first womb transplant to ever be undertaken successfully in the UK from a living donor. That was last year. Since that, Womb Transplant UK and the team have undertaken 3 more womb transplants from deceased donors. So just to clarify that under our opt-out organ donor system that we have in the UK, you can't donate your hands, face, limbs or womb, except in specific particular trials like this one. So these kinds of transplants are really, really rare and they're not part of routine donation yet. So that's where it gets really interesting, that if womb transplants of this kind become more mainstream down the line and become more common, and after this clinical trial, if they're found to be successful, more womb transplants are carried out from deceased donors, then potentially under an opt-out organ donor system, which we have in the UK. So that means there's effectively, you're presumed to have consented to organ donation unless your family refuses. Potentially down the line, we might see this kind of cover womb swap. But just to be really clear that at the moment, that's not the case.
Yeah, Holden, I mean, this operation has actually been a long time coming. How have we got to where we are now with it?
Yeah, it's been a very long time coming, actually. The first research started with animals back in the 60s, but even the first human attempt took place in 2000 in Saudi Arabia. That was using a womb that had been donated by a woman who needed a hysterectomy for other medical reasons. And at the time, the surgery was actually hailed as a success, but I think it was about 5 months after the initial operation, the womb was then rejected by the recipient's immune system. And there now seems to be a consensus that actually that attempt was premature and that there just wasn't enough expertise at the time. And it did take another 11 years until the next attempt, which was in Turkey. And that actually did involve a womb that had been taken from a woman who had died. The next year, surgeons in Sweden successfully transplanted a womb from a live donor, and 2 years later, in 2014, that was the one that led to the first birth of a baby who'd been nurtured in a donated womb. The Turkish transplant actually was also eventually successful in that a baby was born to that woman, but not until 2020. And there often is a long delay between the transplant and any potential birth because of difficulties of conceiving and carrying a child. In total now, there have been 135 transplants and 65 babies born as a result of them.
Yeah, wow. But still, Cindy, Holden was talking there about wombs potentially being rejected by people's immune systems. I mean, this is an operation that presents a bunch of potential complications. Is it safe?
It's definitely a really complicated procedure. So I think in the UK, the NHS consultant Richard Smith, who set up Womb Transplant UK, only set up the charity 25 years ago. So that's how long it has taken the technology to come to this moment of the first live, healthy baby in this country. 25 years of research. Women's bodies, the recipient body has a tendency to reject it, especially during pregnancy. So the woman, someone like Grace, has to take immunosuppressants in order to make sure that doesn't happen. But even then, the womb will only last 5 years, so which is, they estimate, is about enough time for 2 pregnancies. So Grace has said that she plans to have another baby, but then after that needs to get rid of this womb, basically. And actually, both donor woman and the recipient woman need to have counselling, because there is so much, emotionally wrapped up in all of this, in the question of fertility, especially for women. Psychologically and physically, it is definitely a complicated procedure. The thing that it throws up for me is whether or not this is the best way for childless couples to go ahead and do this, considering all the complications. Because I do wonder if, as a society, or as a global society, we don't consider adoption enough. And I was having a quick look. In the UK, there are 84,000 children in care. That's a lot of children not having families. And, far be it from me to tell someone like Grace she should go and adopt instead of having her own child. But I feel like there is not enough encouragement or normalization of adopting the existing children already out there who really, really need help. On average in the UK, these kids spend about 2 years in care, which is a long time. And so I feel quite complicated about this story, because on the one hand, it's a medical marvel, scientific ingenuity and all of that sort of stuff. On the other hand, what does that mean for, the children already born who really need a home?
Harriet, what are your thoughts on that? What are the implications for adoption, given there are so many children in the UK in need of care?
I think it's an incredibly complex and really emotive topic, because you could also theoretically make these arguments about IVF. Like, should people be going through very, very, very invasive, expensive, and actually really quite tough treatment, like for infertility, like IVF, in order to produce a baby, when theoretically one could adopt or one could consider fostering? Also, same discussions around surrogacy. It's incredibly complicated, but I think at the moment, at least some women are getting access to IVF treatment on the NHS to treat infertility. And technically speaking, if you're born without a womb, which it's 1 in 5,000 women born without a womb. That's surprising to me. But also how many women have their wombs removed due to like cancer treatment, for example, or treatment for endometriosis. Should they not also have access to potential treatments for what is absolute uterine infertility? It's an incredibly complicated topic, and it's a very personal choice for families, for women, for couples to decide if they're dealing with infertility. But I do agree with Cindy that I think there's a lot of mystery around adoption in the UK. It's really interesting that people, I think, still consider adoption to be this incredibly complex, expensive, highly mysterious process, when actually they're really trying to combat that. They just haven't really necessarily communicated it. And adoption rates have dropped massively with the rise of IVF and other fertility treatments, because it seems people do still prefer to carry their own babies. It's incredibly complicated. It's incredibly emotive. It also throws up a lot of ethical implications and a lot of very, very, very emotional conversations.
Holden, why is it not yet at least possible to transplant a womb into a man? And if it does become possible, are we all in for another round of gender-related culture wars?
I think the answer to the second part of that question is probably yes. But the first part means that we're not quite at that point yet. There are some biological reasons why it's much harder to transplant a womb into a man than a woman, one of which I saw summed up by a doctor who'd worked on this project as problems with plumbing. So some of these plumbing problems have been overcome. Until recently, one of them was that if you weren't born with a womb, then you didn't have the blood supply to support it. But the British woman who recently gave birth, Grace, also didn't have that blood supply because she had been born without the womb and the sort of surrounding organs. So surgeons in this case created an offshoot from arteries in her thigh to deliver the blood that she needed. And that could theoretically be done for men too. But there are other problems, and the biggest of all is much more structural, in that men's pelvises are just the wrong shape even to carry a baby, let alone deliver it. And that's a much harder problem to solve.
Yeah, just finally, Cindy, why is this your story of the week? What is going to come of this? And, is it going to be a commonplace technology like IVF in a year, 5, 10 years?
I think that is the way that these scientific breakthroughs do tend to be, that once the genie is out of the bottle, we very rarely bring it back in. What's interesting to me is the fact that it's like when IVF came about, there's just this whole new frontier, a whole new group of people who can now have children when they didn't think that they could have their own biological children. Apart from the ethical concerns that we've already talked about, it's also an important story for me because we are facing a demographic crisis in the world in general. One of my specialties is China, and China is predicted to have its population halved by the end of the century. So that's the UN thinks that it will be only about 700 million people living in the country by 2100, which is a massive drop. So considering the demographic crisis that we're facing, these kind of pro-natal scientific developments, I think, are really interesting to keep an eye on. So I think that's why it really spoke to me, especially as you opened, Arion, with the tariffs. It's such a heavy economics and politics week, but there are just these kind of amazing social and scientific stories happening at the same time.
Yeah, well, ethical and demographic issues aside, it is an absolutely fascinating new technology. Next up, it's another new technology which claims to have brought an extinct species back to life. After this. Okay, Harriet, it's your turn. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
De-extinction, the company that just cried wolf.
Over 10,000 years ago, a howl was lost to time. But today it returns. Meet Remus and Romulus, the first two direwolves since the Pleistocene era. At just 15 days old, the pups take their first wobbly steps before a much-needed nap time.
The first dire wolf howl in 10,000 years, a video shared by Colossal Biosciences on Monday. Harriet, what's the story?
So this tech startup, Colossal Biosciences in the UK, claimed that it brought an animal back from extinction for the first time in history, the direwolf. So the direwolf is this massive species of canine. They're not technically wolves. They're big canines that went extinct about 12,000 years ago. And these two puppies, well, three puppies, two born in October, one in January that you just heard there, they're claiming that these puppies are direwolves, so that they've de-extincted an extinct species. And they said that this proved that their de-extinction technology was working, and it was a massive milestone. But actually what we're going to talk about is that they did nothing of the kind.
Yeah, well, exactly, because we've heard this one before, haven't we? No species has completely been brought back yet, and this is no exception.
Yeah, effectively what they've done is made genetically edited grey wolves. So how they've done that is we've talked on this podcast before about CRISPR gene editing technology, so not to go too deep into the science of it, but they effectively extracted the DNA of direwolves from ancient wolf and skull, and they claim that they sequenced the genome from that, and then they compared that genome with like wolves and jackals and foxes to look for specific variants that made direwolfy traits. They then edited the cells of a grey wolf and implanted those cells into the egg and grew this direwolf egg and into embryos, implanted those into domestic dogs, specifically not grey wolves. Obviously, you don't want to be trying to do this with grey wolves. And then these puppies were born, and they are 99.9% grey wolf. They are grey wolves genetically edited to have traits similar to direwolves. So basically they're grey wolves with white fur, slightly bigger, and slightly, we don't really know how they work or what their social structure is going to be. This is actually something quite similar to what this company did in March. So this company claims that they're working on de-extincting the woolly mammoth, the dodo, and the Tasmanian tiger. And in March, they announced that they'd made this big breakthrough in the woolly mammoth goal, that they had genetically edited these mice to be woolly mice. They're hairier mice, effectively.
That technically doesn't sound like a big breakthrough. That sounds like the exact opposite of that. But Cindy, if it walks like a direwolf and quacks like a direwolf, I don't know if they quack, it's basically a direwolf, right? The company talks about functional de-extinction. Is what they have made not close enough to a proper direwolf for our purposes?
Well, my favourite part of this story is one of the spokespeople from the company. The quote is, "These classifications are human constructs," as if DNA is just a human construct. Right. I enjoy that very much. So clearly they're feeling a little bit defensive about it. And, in their defence, the grey wolf is 99.5% genetically identical to the direwolf. So, I'm not a scientist, but it feels like quite a high number. But as Harriet says, it's not really what it has been billed as. To your question about the functional bringing back of these animals, I don't know what I want to believe here, because if they have really brought back these ancient predators, wild predators, and then they're making these puppies grow up in zoo-like conditions, what actually says to me is that this is not really a science that we should be pursuing, because what's the point? These are wild predators who existed on Earth during a different time of society when nobody's saying we want to rewild the direwolf. So why bring them back at all if they have done that? And the same company says that they're on track to bring back the woolly mammoth itself in 2028. Again, my question is, what are you going to do with those animals? Right. Even if they're only 99.9% a woolly mammoth, they're still giant elephant-like, mammoth-like things. What are you going to do with them? And maybe I'm being too much of a bleeding heart about this, but especially to be a wolf and possibly a mammoth. I don't know so much about mammoths, but elephants certainly have social constructs and structures that are very family-based or pack-based, and you can't just have these individual animals like this in almost lab-like situations when we have already, zoos are going out of fashion for the way that it limits existing animals. So why bring these extinct animals back to live in ways that they genetically should not be living in?
Yeah, that does seem to be the question, Holden. Humans have a bit of a history of not always tinkering terribly successfully with ecosystems and with animal life. What is the goal here? You know, if we could bring back a genuine direwolf, or a mammoth or a triceratops for that matter, should we do it?
Yeah, I'm really torn on this between the bleeding heart argument that Cindy just outlined, but there is still a part of me that thinks, yeah, we should go for it. I mean, it would be amazing. And if there was a place where you had direwolves roaming alongside saber-toothed tigers and woolly mammoths and triceratops, as you suggest, I definitely want to go and see it. And the science is impressive, even if it is being oversold by this company. And I'm sure it will get even more impressive. And eventually it will be able to do what the company is saying it's doing now. These sorts of questions, which at the moment are hypothetical, will become real at some point. And there are practical concerns, including, you know, if the goal was to try to have a living population of these currently extinct it's an odd phrase, isn't it? Currently extinct animals, then, you know, how would you get enough genetic diversity into that population for it to survive, given the scarcity of the source DNA? And would they even be able to survive in an environment that's now very different from the one that they adapted to? If the goal is to keep them in captivity, then that raises the ethical questions we've discussed. But, you know, if the goal is to give them more of a life that they have previously had, and to, you know, have them roaming free, then that feels like the sort of thing that's going to become very controversial very quickly. And we have examples now of efforts to rewild bears and wolves and lynxes in the UK. But there was another story this week of the Slovakian government doing a bit of an about turn on efforts to provide habitats to bears. They've had a spate of fatal bear attacks in Slovakia, and as a result are actually going to start culling the bears that they've put so much effort into rehabilitating. So I think if there was a risk of, you know, encountering a triceratops or a direwolf on your walk in the woods, we would probably have similar kind of issues here too.
I mean, I think that is the question that so many people are asking. The kind of, you know, the point is that these are real animals that are being brought back to life. Harriet, you brought to our attention this wonderful rant from the scientist and presenter Adam Rutherford, who said in this piece that he put out on Substack that the wolves that have been bred are sophisticated social animals that have been experimented on for no good reason. Not for medical knowledge, not for conservation reasons, just for business. I mean, is he right? And should one of our concerns here be for these 3 pups that they've bred?
I do think he's right, yeah. I mean, he's also a genetics lecturer, and he did make the point that sticking feathers up your butt doesn't make you a chicken. And equally, slightly tweaking the genes. And they made such tiny changes. This company says that the direwolf and the grey wolf share 99.5% of their DNA. We don't know that. They haven't released the sequence of the genome, but they say that they do. That still leaves space for millions and millions of differences. And they claim that they've turned these grey puppies into direwolves with just 20 gene edits. I mean, like, I'm not a geneticist, but I can hear that sounds like a lot of nonsense. You're producing effectively weird, mutant, orphaned animals with no social structure in place, no kind of inherited knowledge from their parents, no pack that they can interact with. You cannot release them. We have no idea what the long-term health implications are of these genetic edits. What we do know is that cloned animals in particular often have a lot of health issues and die prematurely. We also know that these 3 puppies were the result of multiple embryos and multiple attempts, and lots of the surrogate animals that are used to grow these baby mutants also die. So the company is claiming that they put all this money into efforts to effectively prevent extinction. They're saying that they're using the technology to be able to learn how to introduce genetic diversity into endangered species to prevent extinction. Obviously, this is a lot of money and a lot of resources that could have been better spent just preventing the grey wolf from going extinct in the first place. If you really did want to de-extinct a species, which you can't do, by the way, but if you did want to, you would do so to a species that only very recently gone extinct, and you could extract living DNA from the living nucleus of the last few remaining animals and bring those back into the same ecosystem. But they're not doing that. They're not trying to bring back an extinct species of rat or whatever. So it's a lot of very big splashy PR. But just to be clear on the woolly mammoth thing, they are not actually trying to bring back the woolly mammoth. What they're actually doing is trying to genetically edit African elephants with traits that they think are a little bit mammothy.
Yeah. Okay, so Cindy, if they haven't created something old, and they're not even trying to create something old, have they actually created something new in both the case of the woolly mouse and the direwolf-like thing? And if so, is that something to be excited about? You know, can we look forward to new hybrid creatures with traits from across the animal kingdom?
Oh, I think I've seen too many superhero Hollywood films to be excited about hybrid animals and commercially minded scientists being let loose to do that, I'm afraid. So I'm not super excited about that. I think that it throws up ethical concerns as well for where the science could go next, not just in the animal realm, but also in the human realm as well. You know, cloning is becoming an ever more prevalent science. We are now seeing basically commercial companies offering to clone household pets after they die, so that you could have exactly the same dog, supposedly, after your beloved dog dies. And how long will it be until we start to breach that boundary and think about babies? You know, if you think back to that Chinese scientist He Jiankui, who a number of years ago genetically edited 2 baby girls so that they could be HIV proof from and not have that from their parents, and that was a massive ethical debate, as it should be. But you know, I don't want to sound like a Luddite. I do think that it is important for geneticists to be seeing what they can do. I would just like to see it in slightly more practical things and less gimmicky things. So Harriet mentions the species going extinct now. You know, there are 47,000 species threatened with extinction in the wild at the moment. Animals like the orangutan or the leopard. And also, you know, it's well known that in the Amazon rainforest, so many plant types are still currently unknown. It would be really interesting to see how this technology could be used to preserve some of that DNA that is under threat from extinction, that may have uses for humans in the future, or animals in the future, or the planet in the future, rather than thinking that we're going to have dire wolves and woolly mammoths roaming the earth again.
Harriet, we've all seen the Jurassic Park docu-series of films where, you know, the obvious happens. Where are these dire wolves being kept? And are they going to become a kind of mutant zoo tourism experience? And if so, are they all going to escape and try to eat us?
I think the Jurassic Park comparison is really good, actually, because this is exactly a similar situation where it's the scientists were so preoccupied with whether they could, they didn't stop to think whether they should. And just like in Jurassic Park, or this is my theory anyway, it's all to do with money. Because when you're bringing back something like the woolly mammoth, the direwolf, the dodo, even though, as we've really clearly established, they're not, but if you are, that is splashy PR money-making machine. This company, Colossal Biosciences, is valued at more than $10 billion US. Even though it was only founded a few years ago, there is a lot of money in this. And that money is not because people are trying so very hard to use this gene editing technique to preserve the grey wolf or the African elephant, because this is something that kills a lot of animals. A lot of animals die in this process, not just the babies, but the surrogate mothers as well, from miscarriages, from health complications. In the case of the woolly elephant that they're trying to produce, that will be a lot of elephants dying because they're carrying an elephant baby that's bigger than it should be. They're going to have surgery for C-sections. A lot of animals are going to die. The African elephant is already endangered. So we know that you can't de-extinct a woolly mammoth. We know that if you could de-extinct a species, you'd be using living DNA from a species that's still alive, which they're not. And you know that this isn't really helping conservation or preserving species in any way. So having established all of that, we have to think about what this is actually about. And this is where I think it gets really interesting, because this year as well, scientists in Argentina produced the world's first genetically edited horses that were actual clones of a champion polo pony, but gene edited a little bit so that they could potentially sprint faster. This is huge multi-million-dollar industry in Argentina, is genetically edited or genetically cloned polo ponies. It's a money-making operation. And the founder of this biosciences company, Colossal Biosciences, the founder, it's founded by a tech entrepreneur and a Harvard geneticist, George Church. And Church speculated in 2019 that theoretically woolly mammoths could support business models, including tourism, meat, hair, and maybe legal ivory. So this is what's really going on with this gene editing technology. This is what we're doing with gene editing animals. We're getting more high-tech, faster, targeted selective breeding to produce traits we can better exploit. Genetically edited animals are not a symbol of hope for conservation, and they're not de-extinction. They're not a relic from the past. What they are is basically cash cows.
Okay, well, before this discussion evolves in a very unexpected direction, I declare this segment functionally extinct. Holden, you're bringing the show home today after this. Holden, you're finishing the show. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
How do you put a price on taste?
Some people just pick prices, just sort of willy-nilly. They just pick a price and that's what they sell their work for. And that's fine, except for my feeling was that the customer then doesn't understand why this painting costs $100 and this painting costs $600. Like there's no, like why? You know, why?
Artist Jackie Walvin sharing some thoughts on her video, No One Knows How to Price Art. Holden, does no one know how to price art?
Well, the people who do, or at least think they do, have been putting somewhat lower prices on it over the past 12 months. This is the news that the total value of art sales fell by 12% last year, according to Art Basel and UBS Global Art Market Report, which is generally seen as the best guide to what is often quite an opaque market. As well as that overall fall, it also said that the most expensive artworks fell the furthest. So there was a 39% drop in sales of single works of art worth more than $10 million.
Oh no,
that followed
who cares?
Well, presumably the people who own $10 million artworks do. But also the artists who are producing works of art throughout the price scale do depend on, you know, kind of high-end, high-profile auctions to raise interest, set prices. And so there is, as well as the idea that the art market represents an index of the health of the economy as a whole and the interests of people with money and what they want to do with it, there is a sense that this is part of a creative ecosystem too.
Isn't the art market much like the market for any other commodity, as in it has peaks and troughs? Or is this an unusual and unexpected decline?
I suppose it is like other markets, and there certainly are peaks and troughs, but there had been a long period of rising interest, rising prices up until a couple of years ago. And that's really when the bubble started to burst. And, you know, a lot of what had been driving the rise in prices over that time was real interest in contemporary art, like people producing new works of art. And that's now the area where there has been the biggest fall in prices. And actually older works of art, not just old masters, but actually things produced in the second half of the 20th century, those prices have been much more robust. There has been a bit of a decline in volume of sales in those areas because people who have them are holding on to them, but prices where they have come up to market have been pretty solid.
Cindy, does China's economic slowdown have any bearing on all of this?
It really does. So if you dig into the numbers, actually China has been the most affected. So in China, there was a decline of 33%, which is the largest of any specific market. And so that says to me that actually it is largely because of China's economic slowdown. We know that this has been happening for a couple of years now after COVID, where the Chinese economy just hasn't bounced back. The property market is still incredibly sluggish. So both of these things leading to really low consumer and business confidence. And Arion, to your earlier question to Holden about, you know, how is the art market the same or different to other markets? You know, it's a luxury good. That's what makes it so different. it's a good that people spend on when they have the extra cash. If you don't have the extra cash, you're not going to spend it on art. You're going to spend it on more necessities. Even the rich, they're going to spend it. I don't know what the rich do, maintaining their third homes or their yachts or whatever. But it's not
Very
on that
important.
Nice new painting. And so it is one of the first things to go, like the canary in the coal mine, if you will, for when there is an economic slowdown. But it's not just the Chinese market. The US market has decreased by 9%, France and Italy by 10%, South Korea by 15%. And so I think that's reflective of the fact that it's been a really tough few years economically for the whole world, but definitely wealthy Chinese drove a lot of the boom in the art market in this century as the Chinese got wealthier. But what we're seeing now is the slight kind of dampening and reversal of that trend.
But Harriet, despite the slowdown, do we know anything about who exactly is buying what? Who are the new art buyers? And there are some who have got rich enough during lockdown to join the $1 million art game.
Yeah, so I think this is something that is really interesting about this report. So I was speaking to my friend Holly about this. So she was the head of modern art day sales for Sotheby's, and she's an auctioneer. So she's got some really good insight into this. And she has highlighted that this is like the really interesting aspect, that the share of sales made to new buyers has risen by almost 40%. So there's this whole generation of new art buyers, like a new type of art buyer as well, that kind of lockdown had this massive impact on wealth of people in sectors like tech and software. Suddenly, that there is this whole new type of buyer, lots of buyers with no prior experience of buying art. So art dealers are kind of the challenge is to find a way to reach these new buyers. But overall, yes, the value of the sales in the art world have declined, and there's massive drag on growth at the high end of the market. But overall, the number of transactions actually increased by 3%. So people are buying art and people are buying more art, but it's not just a different type of buyer, it's also a different type of art they're buying. The other thing that she highlighted was really interesting is that the art that's rising in value is works under £5,000. So if you were a new type of art buyer, that might be something that you might consider is taking a punt on sort of a bit of an unknown, a bit of a smaller sale, a bit of a random artist. The other thing that's really rising in value is works by women, partly because they were so historically undervalued that now they might represent better value and better potential, like better investment potential effectively. It's not just that people are now waking up to how important they are, basically.
Holden, what does this mean for artists themselves? Are they going to struggle even more now that, well, at least the top end of the market seems to be dropping out?
I think there's probably a mix of different outlooks depending on where you sit in that hierarchy of artists, and the developments we've just been talking about with sort of more new buyers coming into the market. And, it seems that maybe the market is shifting actually to people who are looking more to collect art for the sake of enjoying art rather than perhaps this sort of very high-end collector or investor who's looking for a profitable place to park a large sum of money. So maybe there will be some very high-profile artists who are still making and selling work at the very top end of the market who will be worried about what the outlook's going to be for the next couple of years, particularly with the added uncertainty of all of the talk about tariffs now. But I'd say if there are, up-and-coming artists who are making a name for themselves, perhaps things look slightly better for them with this sort of increase in volume and interest for slightly less expensive artworks.
And is it likely that Trump's tariffs will affect the art market? Is a Leonardo da Vinci painting now subject to a 10% tariff because he was Italian, for example?
That is a really good question, and there is a lot of uncertainty about that. In fact, different art lawyers are saying different things. Some will tell you that art is exempt from these new tariffs, but others believe it's not. And what's really additionally confusing is that the tariffs are levied on the place that they were made rather than the place they're sold. So if you have a Chinese porcelain vase that's being sold at auction in Paris, the theory is that if these tariffs do apply, they will attract the Chinese level tariff of 125%, I think we're at the moment, and who knows whether that will be the same by the time the podcast comes out. And so, if you're buying, even if it is at the 10% level, if you're buying one of these $10 million plus artworks, you want to be pretty certain whether that's going to cost you an extra $1 million or not. So what the art auction houses are saying is that the whole art sale process has really just ground to a halt for the time being, while everybody works out what the new rules are.
Indy, is this partly a story about changing tastes? You know, is it that people just want to put their money somewhere different? You know, do they want different artists, and do they want just different luxury goods altogether?
Yes, I think so. So the numbers, once broken down, seem to suggest that, as we've mentioned, the contemporary sector was hit particularly hard, dropping 36%, which is the lowest volume since 2018. That's a hefty third off the sales value. Now, I, for one, kind of personally welcome that because I think, if we are going back to something slightly more traditional, it doesn't have to be old masters, but as Holden says, 20th century work, I do feel like some of those artistic productions are better than what we've had in the last 10, 15 years, which for so much of it, maybe it's a result of social media, or maybe it's a result of the booming of PR. It just seems like so much of it is about marketing rather than about real worth. The very infamous example is the banana taped to a wall, right? And so if people are kind of not buying into the hype with that as much now, and certainly it seems like Chinese consumers, younger Chinese consumers, are talking about lower value art pieces that are less hype, then I think that could signal a trend towards genuinely enjoying good pieces of works rather than the things that have hype or are attached to big names.
Oh, I completely disagree. Yeah, I gotta say, I totally disagree with that. I think actually this might be more of a story of taste becoming more risk averse. I'm not sure this is to do with taste or appetite for variety or appetite for the unknown. If anything, I think it's the opposite. I think this is about people. A lot of the art dealers in the report are talking about art buyers wanting to buy something that everyone's already heard of, that the appetite for risk and taking a punt on the unknown is not there anymore. So if anything, actually people are more buying into the hype. Like there was a good piece in the FT not that long ago about Chinese art buyers really going nuts for Picasso, and people wanting to buy art that they've heard of that they consider a safer investment. It's not really necessarily a question of taste as much as it's a question of putting your money in like the art version of safe havens. Like we've talked on this podcast before about how people are investing more in gold because it's a safe haven asset, and how cinema, like the film industry in particular, is investing in sequels, franchises, horror, safe haven cultural output that they know will make money. It's what my colleague Rafi on the US team calls it IP necrophilia, like the appetite for the new and the unknown and the risk. Because of all the geopolitical instability that we've talked about, because of all the fragmentation of last year, the economic turmoil, because of all the uncertainty, people are putting their money where they think that it's going to be safer. It's not even necessarily a question of do they actually like Picasso more than they like new artists.
Well, before people's appetite necrophilia makes the value of this podcast fall faster than Sotheby's Q2 earnings, we'd better leave it there. My thanks to Harriet, Holden and Cindy. And you can follow this show for free and get every episode as soon as it's released by searching for The Week Unwrapped, wherever you get your podcasts, and then tapping follow. You can also get 6 free issues of The Week magazine, by the way, with a trial subscription. Just go to theweek.com/subscriptions. In the meantime, I've been Arion McNicoll. Our music is by Tom Morby, the producer Olly Peart at Rethink Audio. And until we meet again to unwrap next week, bye-bye.